Welcome to another episode of Out of the FHIR podcast where we talk about health technology and interoperability. And we love to have awesome guests on the show like you, Don Rucker. Welcome. And also we have an announcement that Benji Graham is now joining me on this podcast, so that I'm not trying to mingle my own words and try to act like I'm an expert in FHIR. Like, I am a true expert now in Benji. He's one of the only people in the country that can say he's a real expert because he has certifications to prove it. Why don't we do some quick introductions? Don, obviously, everyone probably knows who you are if you're in the health tech space over the last 10, 15 years, but why don't you, give a brief intro for our listeners?
Yeah, well, thanks. And thanks for listening. So maybe sometimes the origin stories are fun here, and, which was now a while ago, sadly. So when I was a med student, a first year med student, I was frankly appalled at the waste that I saw. Just, and mind you, when you're first year med student, you're scared shitless, right? You have to talk with a patient and you have to remember all of those questions you were supposed to ask in the history and the review of systems, and then all the physical exam and, touch the patient. It's a lot, when you're starting out. But in spite of all of that, in spite of having, the fresh white, first year medical student, baby lab coat, with all the crinkles from the box, and it was still obvious to me, just sitting, waiting to meet or talk with the patient, that the amount of waste on this med-surg nursing unit, just in the few minutes I was sitting there, was appalling. The lack of automation, the lack of any sort of consumer-facing activity. That was my first, my goodness, this needs to get fixed. Now, at that point, I'm 23, first year med student, something like that. And so then I got interested in decision making. I thought the guy named John Eisenberg, who eventually went to head ARC before his very tragic early death, and from glioblastoma. And so he was a first year faculty member. I was a third year med student at that point. And we're fiddling with decision making and drawing decision trees. And I thought, that's the answer. And then when I got to UCSD as a resident, I realized the actual problem was not lack of decision trees, it was lack of data. And essentially, we were running a paper record shop back then, as everybody was. And I decided, well, I'm going to try to fix this, right? Modesty not being one of my totally strong points. But I knew it was going to be quite the slog. And so I decided, well, I better learn computer science, which was not really geared to do, to be honest with you, at that point in the middle of residency. But was able to put together a program and was lucky enough to get into Stanford both for their MBA program, the standard, Masters of the Universe type of activity, and a brand new medical computer science program run by a guy named Ted Shortliff, who invented rule-based expert systems, as we talk about AI these days. And as part of that, I actually had to learn computer science. So I'm sitting in there as a 30-year-old with 18-year-olds trying to get a B average. I think I had to get a B average to
B's
get my
get degrees, Don.
What?
B's get degrees.
B's get degrees. For me, also funding. So both. And so then that got me started on the journey of, how do you do this? How do you make computing something that is helpful for patients and for the country? And, was involved in building the first Windows EMR back in the late 80s. But then for many years was at Siemens, the former Shared Medical Systems, doing CPOE, and, rolled that out to lots of folks. And so had lots of interactions with the system. And the whole time, I've also been a practicing physician at, doing, for the most part, inner city ER at Beth Israel for over a decade, at Penn for over a decade, at Ohio State I'm a Red Cross volunteer in the Army at Fort Belvoir. So I've sort of eaten the dog food as well as, fiddled with the making. So hopefully that gives people a little bit of background. Obviously, I was national coordinator, which is sort of mostly known.
Just
And now,
casually on the
yeah,
side, you
now
were
I'm
the
at a
national coordinator for health IT.
yeah, yeah, now I'm at a company called One Up Health, where we're basically implementing FHIR APIs at scale using modern data architectures on the payer side of things, which is pretty exciting. So, at any rate, that's a long, tortured background, but hopefully a couple of things that people may know.
Yeah, thanks for that, Don. Really, really interesting. I know you as former national coordinator and as the are you chief interoperability officer or chief standards officer there at One Up Health?
Chief
Some
strategy officer.
strategy. That's yeah, but yeah, it's wonderful, wonderful to have you on. I'm really excited to talk about pretty much everything. Yeah, Gene, sounds really good. So Gene, let's dive right into it. So, you know, you sort of correctly or went into a little bit of detail about like the issues that you were able to see at the ground level as a medical doctor, as a clinician, right there at the point of care. So let's talk about kind of the birth of sort of healthcare APIs and health tech in general, right? Give us kind of a feel for, what specifically about data was broken prior to the emergence of FHIR, and then do you feel like FHIR is kind of the final destination, or is this just another step upon the road to kind of resolving these issues?
Yeah, no, I think FHIR is an essential. And we'll get to how it's essential because maybe not in the way that folks think. I think sadly, the real issue here that lets all of the slop and waste in healthcare go is the fact consumers don't control the spending. It's all done by third parties. That's the fundamental thing, right? In healthcare, we settle for stuff that we would never settle for in any other part of our lives. It's like if every car didn't work, if every flight crashed, if I mean we if nothing we bought worked, right? We settle for stuff in healthcare because we have no control over it. And so the question of control is essential because in a functioning consumer driven economy, interoperability is demanded and provided, right? Your cell phone works, right? I mean, everywhere. I'm sitting here in the damn mountains of Park City. They're gorgeous. And for most of the mountains, in the middle of literally nowhere, the cell phone works, right? Just when you think about it, just amazing. And so, what was the thing that broke the connection between patients and their medical care? Because the lack of interoperability starts there. And it was 1942 and something called the Stabilization Act. And this was an act employers, right? So 1942, I realize people don't learn history much anymore. I remember all the Jay Leno jaywalking things, when was World War II? 1971 or something, but at any
As
rate,
far back as the consciousness goes, right?
yeah. So,
Yeah.
so the wartime employers in 1942, right? Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 41, they were trying to hire people. And, this is back when patriotism was a thing. So people were enlisting, Rosie the Riveter type of thing. And so they made healthcare, there was almost nothing to be had in healthcare. Kaiser had done it a little earlier at a couple of his job sites, made that pre-tax. So it was basically a perk that the wartime employers could offer to entice people. Now, mind you, healthcare in the 40s and 50s, there was almost nothing, right? For folks who are sort of clinicians. So in 1965, when Medicare started, which then instituted price controls, which was the second big disaster of care allocation. But when you think in 1965, what did you have? You had no CT scans. You had no MRI. You had the only endoscopies. The only X-rays you had were chest x-rays, IVP dye studies, and barium enemas. The only surgery, you had almost no cardiac surgery. They did do heart valves in that era. You know, they didn't even really know how heart attacks happened, to be perfectly honest. That wasn't discovered until a lot later, at least the brushstrokes of it. And, you had essentially no knowledge of cancer. You couldn't diagnose a cancer because you had a CT scan. So, the cancer was monstrous. Even basic things like high blood pressure control, there were essentially no medicines for that. You certainly didn't have statins. You didn't have any modern medicines. So there wasn't a lot to pay for. Basically, the things you paid for were appendectomies, maybe a couple other surgeries, passing a broken bone. There was just very little to spend in this pre-tech era. I remember I was able to use HIPAA to get my brother's medical records. So in 1961, my parents allowed me, my brother's delivery bill this is New Jersey, was $150. Delivery baby boy. The bill was addressed to my dad. My mother wasn't mentioned on the bill. It was on a little piece of paper that I'm going to show was just like 3-part burst carbon, the size of a 5x8 pad. They didn't even have a full piece of paper. It was typed out. It was very simple. In that era, interoperability, all of this stuff was sort of a nothing burger. I think once we got to computers, the possibility of computers, right? And so your audience probably knows, but the first computers in healthcare were really billing computers. So shared medical systems that was purchased by Siemens when I was there, or just after I joined. They actually, along with HBO, a couple other companies, built the first billing systems. And this is back in the era before you had the DRGs. So every item was itemized. Remember when I was an intern, DRGs came at the end of my internship year. My internship year, we took every little sticker, every IV, every tongue blade, every glove, every piece of nonsense. Of course, every med, every IV bag had a little sticker, and we would put them on the foot of a bed on a card. Sort of, if anybody in your audience knows what green stamps are. Now I'm really dating myself, but you can Google. It was a mainstay of consumer affinity before the modern world started. That's how it was billed. So your hospital bill was thousands of lines of, IBM line printer, 5 lines with a white background, 5 lines with a green background, kind of computer paper. But there was still nothing clinical, really. That was the first computing, and interoperability wasn't really an issue.
Right.
You generated a paper bill. The first
transactional, right? So it's focused on the transaction of healthcare rather than
paper-based transactions. Paper-based transactions, exactly. So now come the 1980s. And in the 1980s, I would say there have been a couple forcing functions for interoperability. I would say the first forcing function, right, because well before HIPAA, right, these computer bills didn't really go anywhere, at least in my memory of it. They were mailed. I mean, there were clearinghouses and stuff, I guess. I'm not even sure about that. That was honestly a little bit before my time. But the first, certainly clinical interoperability, were labs. Because what happened, what has forced healthcare is when there's too much data and you can't deal with it in paper. So when I was an intern and a resident and med student, labs were printed out or handwritten on little slivers of paper that were about 2 inches by 7 inches. And then they were glued shingle style into special pages of the paper chart, which had little glue strip shingle holders for each lab. So the lab section was like shingles on your roof, right? And they were color coded. So there were chemistry labs, there were hematology labs, there were coagulation labs. Well, that got to be sort of comical, right? I mean, these things, like, they would fall out, right? The chart had been just bound paper in volumes. But now as you had all these labs. So with automated labs, the first sequential analyzer started coming in the 1980s, the Coulter counter, which automated hematology. Before that, it was just looking at microscope slides and spinning a hematocrit with like a spinner to sediment it out. Then you had enough lab data, and that's where folks like Clem McDonald, HL7
Yeah.
V2 came, and eventually ADT came off of that. So that was the first big thing. But mind you, at this point, didn't really have the automated. I mean, there were CPT codes, but they weren't. There wasn't really automation. The next two big things that happened to get automation going, the sort of the more mundane one was in the late 80s and early 90s. There were some EHRs, Data Medic, where I was employee number 6. We had an EHR. Kurzweil had an EHR. These were early speech recognition, by the way. So we used drag and dictate, one word at a time. So we were the first ever to use drag and dictate in healthcare. Just to go back in the
Wow.
Wayback Machine. And then there was also transcription services, mostly in India, were, providing cheap transcription. And so you could get a higher CPT code by saying more or maybe using templates. Almost entirely it was transcription. The government got pretty wigged out about that because the evaluation management code spend started increasing. So that's when they went to these highly standardized templates on the thought, or law of unintended consequences, on the thought, we will make you say more. You then have to spend more on transcription, so you can't just bill for more all the time. That was the whole thesis. So the 1995 CPT modifications, so for folks, remember till Seema Verma Demetrius and I got rid of it in Trump 1 because it was just so toxic and evil. But what then happened is almost at the same time, smart people realized these EMRs can generate a template. So I don't even have to pay for transcription. I'm just going to cut and paste my note. And that was the actual forcing function for EHRs. It wasn't meaningful use. I think a lot of people, maybe younger folks say, oh, it was meaningful use. Most practices had EMRs before meaningful use started.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean,
it was like a low percentage, right? It wasn't anywhere close to, meaningful use. I think
it was rapidly increasing.
Yeah.
It was hitting the majority, well, certainly of hospitals and actually the majority of office practices before meaningful use ever started.
That proper.
You had, because the payers then would pay less for these, less documented CPT codes. So you actually had, CPT code warfare. And so that was one big thing that caused computers and, raised the issue of interoperability. Didn't solve it, but raised it. The thing that at that same time that was a forcing function, sort of the 1990s version of HL7V2, was actually the onset of CAT scanner, of modern CT scanners, which at that point, again, Moore's Law, computer science, were called helical scanners for folks who remember. And the problem, these scanners, which were awesome, they just changed the practice of medicine. In 1992, if you were an ER doc, as I was, if you had somebody with abdominal pain, you would get a surgical consult. By 1995, and usually this happened within a year at any given site, by 1995, no surgeon in the country would see a patient for abdominal pain unless you had a CT scan. I mean, it was unbelievably fast. And with the CT scans and the speed and the accuracy, and they got fast enough that you could actually gate out abdominal motion and discover appendicitis, aortic aneurysms, all kinds of stuff.
Wow.
Ectopic pregnancies, things. The intra-op play here was before, so 92, let's say, when you got any kind of image, you would have silver film. So, but you've probably seen this in some old TV show or movie.
Mhm.
So you have this sheet of, I think it was 12 by 18 silver film, and would be hung on these
Light board.
view
Yeah.
boards called, light board alternators, right? And so the techs would take the developed film, you had to develop it, and they would hang it on these things that had little clips. And as a non-radiologist, you always knew who was a real radiologist, because the real radiologists were so good. They could throw this film at the clips on the alternator from like 6 inches away, and the little clips would grab the film. And it was like a real art of motor skill. So if you couldn't do that, by definition, you weren't a real radiologist. Well, the problem was each scan started generating 40 of these things. So the radiologist couldn't get efficient, because instead of having all of their, afternoons or mornings work, row after row, it was just one single patient CT scan. And that's when PAC, so picture archiving communication storage, came in. And that forced all of radiology to become digital. And because, unlike the rest of healthcare, in radiology, when radiologists purchase supplies, they act as a true market-bearing consumer. So the imaging box vendors, so i.e. GE, Siemens, and Philips, they wanted to sell the radiologist proprietary non-interoperable systems. I can assure you, I was there. And the radiologist said, no.
Yeah.
If you guys don't do standards, we're not buying. DICOM, extremely powerful, extremely robust, and standard quality enforced by a market. So the polar opposite of all the crap we do today with, stuff like TEFTA, right? This was market enforced. If you lost parts of the image, right, of the CT scan, or tried to get somebody locked into some proprietary vendor thing, hell to pay. The manufacturers of the scanners, the CT, the MR, and eventually all of imaging, they were scared. So they did interoperability, true interoperability, no questions asked interoperability. Your thing worked just the same way now. Cell phones, you can call any number in the world.
So let's go back to the years that you were leading ONC,
Yeah.
Don, and you were probably there in the most consequential time for health
Yeah.
IT. What do you look back on and you say, I'm really proud of this as the
Yeah.
big thing? And then what is one thing that maybe you wish you did different?
Yeah. So there's just one more step between that and the history. So if you notice in that whole history, and this is what we addressed at ONC, there was no real clinical interoperability, right? I mean, labs, imaging with HIPAA, payment, but the actual note, the care of the patient, that was missing. It was like the big black hole in interoperability. HL7 tried with HL7v3, which was, an object-oriented disaster. Not that object-oriented programming is bad. I think it's actually quite elegant, but what they did was too complicated. The remnants of that, the ashes were CCD, CCDA, so XML documents, which, we still use. And then Graham Grieve came up with FHIR, and you've probably had multiple podcasts on that history, so I won't belabor that. The prior administration, so the Obama administration, which was the main administration for the early days of ONC, though it was started by George Bush and David Brailer. But the big money came with the High-Tech Act, and that was basically meaningful use. We're going to subsidize, just have an EHR. And so then David Blumenthal, we don't, we got to require something if we're giving you all of this money, quote unquote. So then they came up with meaningful use, which, let's leave it ill-conceived. I could go on to it for hours, but we don't have that. So, and people sort of knew. So 2016, cell phones were a real thing, right? So we were a number of years in. We had apps on cell phones, right? And cell phone apps were like a real thing. And so then Congress, in one of these interregnums when the parties talked to each other, which was between President Obama was still the president, Trump had gotten elected. So was, the sort of the famous lame duck. So the 2016 lame duck, they passed the Cures Act almost unanimously. Most of it's with FDA stuff. But there was a big section in there that has, APIs without special effort. It has information blocking. It has TEFCA in it. And so that was passed almost unanimously. And so when I got there in 2017, we ended up, ONC was assigned the rule writing to make this happen. Congress passes a law. It goes to the Secretary of, in this case, Health and Human Services. And then within that big organization, if there's a rule required, then it's delegated, like who's going to write the rule.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what ONC is, a regulatory agency. So that was came out as the 2020 Cures Act interoperability rule. And that required APIs without special effort. So there were a couple critical things in the language of that. First of all, the penalties on some level were for EHRs and networks were sort of unlimited. It was $1 million per item, but there was no definition of an item. There's still actually no definition of an item. And, the provider penalties on lack of interoperability then were to be assessed by CMS. And, for various squabble reasons at the very end, well, mostly for COVID, nothing got enforced in the Trump one, because we didn't even have the timeline for that, because these rules require a little bit of notice for reasons that I'm not going to speculate on. The Biden administration did nothing with information blocking effectively, and now apparently maybe there will be some enforcement. So that was that, but the key thing was that the APIs had to be without special effort. That is the killer phrase, because it meant you had to do standards-based APIs. It couldn't be certain vendors, could just force proprietary APIs.
Right.
I went to this whole long DICOM thing because that's the exact. Now, because there are no consumers, DICOM standards were enforced by radiologists as purchasers of equipment in hospitals, right? We don't have that equivalent forcing function in healthcare. So government has to be the forcing function. Highly inefficient, and nowhere near as good as DICOM, because, when people speak with their money, the world listens. When people speak with, a complicated regulation and information blocking, enforcement, and abstract concepts, the money goes to lawyers, to lobbyists, to delay, right? The consumer's just hosed in this. So that is, I think, the history, Gene, of that. And most of the work was actually in writing that rule was the challenge of what are fair prices. So this is a Republican administration. This is not like Mamdani. We're going to say, we're going to stop rent control. You just have to rent your apartment for free, right? It's a different, Republican administration, at least at the moment, in general, different world. So we had to come up with sort of reasonable rates. And, that's sort of a fool's errand on some level. You can't really mathematically set a rate. Price controls, which of course is the way all of CMS fee-for-service Medicare works, right? The fee schedule, which is 10,000 pages of regulations every year with that year's fee schedule over all of the different codes. So we came up with, and this is the, very good legal team at ONC. So a bunch of people led by at least Anthony, but, a number of people in the ONC legal team. We came up with the concept of costs reasonably incurred, exceptions that are allowable for information blocking, right? It's going to cause harm or technically can't be done or force of nature, right? So common sense allowable exceptions and things like non-discrimination, right? So you can't just do a deal with one of your favorite partners where maybe you're getting money on the back end somehow. So we put in a lot of enforcement things. That was most of the rule writing in the Cures Act, just as a work product. I know these rules go on forever and ever for all kinds of reasons. So that was the thing. I would say, obviously, that I think was transformative. It has not been overturned by the courts. We had hundreds of stakeholder meetings and press outreach to, talk with people, inform people. So this was not a command and control thing. This was really talking with folks, getting buy-in, or at least acquiescence, as the case may be. It's very interesting. Certain vendors took out ads against ONC in like the DC airport and subway thing. It's pretty interesting when you're running an agency and you see an attack ad put out against your agency
Wow.
at the airport or the subway. Incentives. If the patient can't shop, if there's no economic consequence, FHIR, this was something Ken Mandel, Dan Gottlieb, and Josh Mandel
Yeah.
came up with technically at Boston Children's. We were able to put that in. And talking with Ken about when Ken told me that the original FHIR APIs only returned one record at a time, I was flabbergasted. I took a whole entire semester of database. The thought that a query would only return one record was just mind-numbing. I said, well, yeah, we want records in bulk, which is how the name bulk got started. Maybe it should have been called something else, but it's short, sweet. The downside, so then the other thing that was sort of a loose end was TEFCA, which I never understood which lobbyist inserted that. It's only like 3 lines of the law, and it's very murky. The very goal of TEFCA is sort of delusional when you get right down to it, because you're saying you're going to build a network of networks somehow. Well, the world has solved networking. It's called the internet, right? If you think that ONC is going to invent a materially better version of the internet, right, which is really what this claims or purports to do, you're just delusional. However, there's a law, there's a will, there's a way. And if you can put some private purpose to it or use it to block some public purpose, shit happens.
Well, let me. I love this topic, by the way, Don, and I want to pull the thread a little bit with you. I think that creates just it's sort of an inherent conflict in my mind level. And I think something that they realize is we have a lot of these regional HIEs, we have a lot of these smaller, larger, different HIEs that are exchanging different data, and they have different data. And speaking from my experience as when I work on the payer side, it was difficult to acquire data. You had to go and you had to barter with all of the EHRs, the HIEs, the immunization registries, everybody, and you had to stand up all of these point-to-point connections. So that's definitely difficult. And each of them will have their own version of trust and security. And so now you're all of a sudden paying a large team of people to manage all of your connections, and that data becomes very expensive. Whereas TEFCA I see as an attempt to create a standardized trust framework where we're all using the same protocols, we're all exchanging the same data in standardized ways and using the same standards. But I love hearing your thoughts, so I want to turn it back over to you. Tell me what you think there.
Yeah, well, you've given a great argument for TEFCA, and the only piece to add to that in the classic argument for TEFCA is you will magically know where every patient got their care through a record locator service, right? That's the other sort of like magic bullet. So a couple things, and we don't want to make this all about TEFCA. A couple things for your audience before we get to some interesting FHIR stuff. The premise, the reason that the point-to-point stuff is so brittle, as you've described, Gene, Benji, is because you have incentives to not share information. The dominant incentive for a big bulked up provider network, which most of them are, right? They've all merged every week. Somebody merges with somebody, and then they use an EMR that has great interoperability within the enterprise and near zero outside, or just painful and cumbersome, right? Try going to your big dominant academic or non-academic delivery system and asking the doctor to place a digital order outside of that delivery system, your head will flatten as you hit the wall, right? They're designed to prevent interoperability. Their very essence, their very economic reason is to prevent interoperability. And so they do it with all of these different, different format, a different this, a different that. So the problem for interoperability, if you haven't addressed that in some material way, the interoperability you're getting is faux interoperability. It's little drabs that don't change the price dynamic, don't change the performance dynamic, right? It's fake interoperability. And we have fake interoperability everywhere in healthcare, right? Because they can't say, a vendor can't say, I'm not going to interoperate, right? They may say, well, the modern API has been around for decades. If you want something, you need to go to Care Quality or, pick your vendor. The HIEs are a great way of at least having some governance on that and providing some shopping ability with neutral governance on data. So I'm a huge fan of the HIEs. The point-to-point is a very, so there are two things I want to quickly talk about. Point-to-point and record locator services. So point-to-point, it's used as a pejorative, that we need like some central clearinghouse like TEFCA. Well, point-to-point is the modern internet.
Right.
Right?
Well,
we'll get to that. There's some asterisks there. So it's domain name server, right?
It's like you have Google and you have other things. I think the problem is in healthcare, we don't have that.
Correct.
Well,
like I would say the internet is more federated than point to point.
Well, the internet fundamentally is point to point. It's called an IP address, right? The IP addresses are unique.
Sure. All right. I'll grant that. Yeah.
There's a local network. And what you need are, some DNS servers, to parse that out. I mean, you can have value add with something like Google or Claude or have you. So the thing that point to point doesn't work, we have a monstrous proof statement that it does. It's called the internet. So if somebody says, point to point doesn't work and we need, whatever, TEFCA, well, you don't have the internet. You don't have cell phones. You're using point to point all day long. So then the next question, that's a fundamental question, is record locator services. This really gets into privacy, right? Patient-physician privacy has been a thing. I was going to look it up. I still have to look it up, but I'm sure it's been around for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. I don't know, but it's certainly been around the entire time of modernity, when there was, care to be had that wasn't just nonsense, right? Cod liver oil, cocaine, right? And
like together at the same time.
A lot of patent medicines, yeah, they had all kinds of shit,
In the Coca-Cola.
if you like that. So the record locator service, so it's worth thinking about that. It totally destroys patient privacy, right? If you're going to have the claim that a single query gets all of your records, think what that means. It means every single provider has to, on a near real-time basis, because most of the economic value is in records and care being currently administered, right? It's not in that you had, your ingrown toenail removed when you were 10. So that means every provider has to say to their QHIN or somebody, this is every patient I have seen today, all the time, right? Or every query has to go to every provider and have you seen, Gene or Benji, right? Those are massively privacy violating things, and you can't encrypt the location. You can encrypt the payload, but you can't encrypt the location. So if you're presumably not an issue in this particular group of podcast, participants, using an abortion clinic, right? If Planned Parenthood has a query or reports that they saw you, massively privacy violating, an HIV clinic, a mental health, a behavioral health clinic. So it's an absolute innate drop of privacy. As folks who may have seen my LinkedIn post last week point out,
I
The
did.
solution to this is just to have the patient consent. With open ID and all this stuff, let the patient decide where their damn stuff goes. That's what HIPAA actually says. It
Right.
doesn't say come up with a fraudulent scheme to claim treatment. That's not what it says. That's what
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean, I think, Don, what you're talking about is a great representation of, some of the inherent issues of why this stuff is so hard.
Yeah.
And I think that it's not the lack of trying, and
Hmm.
to your really well put historical lesson here, hopefully for everybody. This has been an ongoing effort over multiple administrations on both sides across probably the most bipartisan issue that this country has ever had, right? Like this has been an ongoing thing all the way from Bush all the way to Trump. So, and one of the things you're talking about is why it's inherently difficult and why we're still there. And people are still talking about where's my interoperability? And well, because you're not solving the interoperability is not inherently a technical problem, nor is it a problem with regulations. It is actually a problem of incentives for the patients, providers, and payers, essentially.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, the only way you're going to solve this, right? I saw ONC just put out some contracts for auditing of, treatment purposes. Look, security has been solved in the rest of the internet. It's called zero trust, right? This is what this, speed of trust and trust networks. I mean, it's a phooey type of thing, right? We know how to do trust. It's called zero trust. You don't trust anybody. And then people with a right to data give you a public key permission to it, right? And then if you did that with specific public key permissions, then you would sort of be like where HIPAA is today, and you could hold people accountable on things. And ideally, it would be the patient. But the whole concept of trust networks is such a goof of human nature, right? It has nothing to do with healthcare, right? It has zero to do with healthcare. It's about zero trust. It's about zero trust networks. This is a fundamental security thing. It has literally nothing to do with healthcare. It's about human nature and honor and honesty and all that kind of stuff. So trying to do a trust network is sort of fool's gold. No matter how many audits you have, right? Because just one person penetrating, right? Are you really going to trust Putin no matter what he attests to? Right? No. Trust networks are,
He might be one
are
of our viewers, Don. So let's.
yeah,
No, I'm
yeah.
just kidding.
Well, they killed many of my relatives back in the old country. So
Yeah, and I don't think, I don't think I want him listening to this podcast because I
Okay.
have pro
yeah,
Ukraine.
yeah. Hopefully that he's busier with other stuff. So the final thing I wanted to say is sort of FHIR. So, and interoperability, what will happen? I think what's going to happen, again, some of this is hope, is the new generations of consumers are going to demand digital care, not because they can shop for it, because we'll probably still have enough rules to prevent them from shopping for it, but just from a consumer satisfaction point of view, right? As the incentive to to move their care. And they're going to demand modern RESTful APIs to move their data. And they don't even want to know what it is, right? How many, I saw, for example, ONC had, 1 billion Tefka transactions. How many RESTful API calls are there every day in the US? A trillion? Multiple
Goodness.
trillions? Right? So if you sort of do some math, it's not the billion in Tefka, it's the missing 999 billion transactions that were prevented or delayed by not having modern APIs, right? So the incumbents have successfully prevented stuff, working through the government and the regs and the payment. I believe that FHIR, right? FHIR is JSON. FHIR makes RESTful APIs much lower cost, right? This is obviously the issue with Tefka. Tefka tries to prevent that with fake, FHIR stuff, but basically a document architecture, things like facilitated FHIR, that are information blocking, right? They interfere with the access, exchange, and use of information. That's what information blocking is, those three words. access, exchange, and use. So how do you get around these APIs that interfere, between the brokers, the cumbersome non-real-time stuff, the ancient document payloads, right? Like, why don't we have AOL and Yahoo as the main source of our modern data anymore? Because this stuff doesn't work. I believe that FHIR lubricating JSON in healthcare with RESTful APIs is going to be dynamite. It's going to take a while. I don't know if I'm going to be, on which side of the ground I'm going to be on when it happens, but I'm an eternal optimist. And that's what I think is exciting. It's dynamic. When we met and talked at Dev Days, I mean, the progress is amazing. So I'm hugely the optimist because these cumbersome brokered things, they're going to go away because with RESTful APIs that are secure, you'll just go directly at, one thousandth of the cost, right?
And
Water flows downhill.
I mean, I showed an example of that. I was able to connect to my local primary care providers with my AI agent and pull the data in. I think that's what the true promise of all of this is, not to unlock another use case for a vendor to be able to sell their
Yeah.
wares, but really like good for the patient, so that the patient can finally use this data. And now that we have AI, they can hit any API in seconds
Yeah.
and do it successfully. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
that's a massive forcing function to low cost, non-brokered stuff. Right.
and the QR code, right? The take the QR code to your doctors, to your new doctor, and now you're granting them access and an embedded consent within something like that in your app, right?
Yeah,
And you can,
exactly.
all,
Well, you have so many ways in technology now to get patient control and consent, and they're going to want it. We haven't really had monster TEFCA or scandals yet, but we will, right? I mean, I'm not going to talk about all the lawsuits back and forth. There are other sources for that. You can find them easily enough on the internet, some of which are awesome, I will say in passing. But, this will get forced out of the system. The question is, can we do it in a way that really helps us sooner, makes the patient experience? I mean, in my vision of the world, we're already instrumented. Our phones know where we are all the time, what we're doing. And there's so much opportunity for data to increase health. It's just stunning. And it's all prevention, right? The system, of course, doesn't want prevention because it's not paid for it, right? Better have your cabbage, or your, whatever. Uh, But digital is going to allow prevention. And God knows we probably need it as a country, but that's a whole other issue. I say that being smug. I did a 60-mile bike ride at altitude today. So
Oh, yeah.
with the
Oh, yeah.
elevation game. So I feel that, at least for today, the plaque has been moved around in my body.
Making us feel completely out of
All
shape.
with,
Right.
all with RESTful APIs, by the way, and digital feedback on my Garmin. Right?
Right.
That's the world we want for healthcare.
Yes.
So let me pluck at one more small thread.
Sure.
I know we're close to time here, but you mentioned something about like record locator service earlier, and that got me thinking about the like one of the things that, and I'm not even just focused on TEFCA here. I'm focused on broader interoperability. But one of the big issues that keeps coming up is this idea of identity and patient identity, and are we talking
Yes.
about the same patient?
Yes.
And when we think about specifically in the U.S., right? If we think about like master patient identity, that's really blocked, I think, legislatively, right? So we've got to think beyond an ENPI, because I just think like, so where are you at? Like, what are your thoughts on how we make identity and the problem of identity? How do we make that interoperable, and how do we like start moving
Yeah.
the wheels on that?
That is such a central question that really gets at the heart of this. And so I think the answer to that, and I've obviously had a lot of chances to think about it because, one of the most frequent questions when I was at ONC is, well, how come ONC is not pushing for a national patient identifier? Well, we already have national patient identifiers called social security number, or your Medicare number. Medicare paid tens of thousands of dollars in fraud just on my behalf till I opened my EOB and realized a lot of these bills were fraudulent, right? Again, when the patient's not in control and you get an envelope that says, this is not a bill, it's not the highest priority to open the envelope. So when I finally opened the envelope, oh, geez. So I got a new National Patient Identifier Medicare number. And, we have driver's licenses. They're not really powerful. And let's say, I don't know what percentage of the population is here illegally, undocumented, whatever word you want to use for it, but it's around at least 10%, right? So they're not going to sign up for an identifier. So the whole thing is a little bit of a goof, right? There's no patient matching algorithm that would tolerate a 10% mismatch rate. And of course, it's very much by different names and geographies. I think what's going to happen here is it's going to be this combination. And this is why we only used OAuth 2 in the rule, because it was abundantly clear even 6-7 years ago that identity and proof are advancing super rapidly in the consumer economy, that whatever ONC did, again, sort of like reinventing the internet, was just a fool's errand. I think stuff that the Karen Alliance has done with OpenID and, Amy Gleason and folks is awesome. I mean, if you have OpenID, the clear ID.me login and the National Provider Directory that was also required in the Cures Act, people sort of forget that had as much legislative language as TEFCA, but, the TEFCA folks tried to, deep six it. If you have a National Provider Directory, then, you're going to have effectively unique identification. The real economic answer, though, Benji, is the people who have a right to the data actually perfectly well know who they are. The people with a right to a data don't really have patient matching problems. Now, look, I'm an ER doc. I know there's people coming into the ER in coma. I know that. And you can even have break the glass. I mean, you can deal with that in various ways. That's not the reason to bollocks up the whole country's healthcare system for the number of those patients, since all of that is pretty much formulaic anyway. The people who have a right to the identity know uniquely who the other parties are. So those three parties are the patient, the payer, and the provider, right? And they uniquely know, because look at it, the provider isn't going to see you unless they've done, again, modulo, you're coming in coma and EMTALA or something. But if you make an appointment, while you're on the phone making your appointment, they're running a 270, 271 eligibility check. They are not going to put you on the calendar if they don't think you're insured, or, they're going to ask for some workaround. The morning of the appointment or the night before, they're going to check again. Is Benji still insured, or did he slack off? Right? So the provider knows exactly who you are and exactly who the provider or the payer is. The payer knows who they've insured, right? I mean, they're not just randomly sending checks because somebody got care somewhere. They know 100% with no matching problems whom they've insured. And I tell you, I have never gotten an accidental check from a payer for any medical care that I provided as a doc. So I'm pretty sure, the payers know exactly who the providers are, and vice versa, right? Because, they wouldn't have the provider wouldn't have registered you.
Right.
So when you look at that triangle, right, each of the three legs of that triangle have perfect identity, right? So the people who have a right to the data under HIPAA, and morally, frankly, more important than HIPAA, don't have an identity matching problem. If you're some law firm scavenging for patients for some class action lawsuit, you have an identity problem. If you're trying to set up some kind of, scammy case management thing and to fraud Medicare, you have an identity matching problem, right? For your autism center or for your, end of life program, you have an identity matching problem. You don't really have a lot of identity matching problems if you have a right to the data. So that, I think, is the heart of it. And of course, what that also means, to get back to the single point of query is you have hard IP addresses or cell phone numbers. So you know who these people are. And with a little juice from a provider directory, you have true interoperability. And you'll have the past history, or you can get it. So that's, I think, the way this should be addressed and will likely be addressed.
Well, thank you, Don, very much. I think I would
Not
say
too long. My
this is-
apologies.
This was great. Wonderful.
we didn't even scratch the surface, probably.
Yeah.
So we're going to go ahead and invite you back, Don, for part 2, where we go real deep on things we haven't even talked about. Quality measurement.
Oh, yeah.
AI. We didn't touch on AI.
Yeah, AI and working as an ER physician for
There
many
you go,
years.
yeah.
All
Wanna
the
hear that?
interesting stories you could probably tell. So anyway, Benji, any last words here?
No, I want to say a huge thank you, Don. I mean, I met you first when I was working at HCSC, and we talked when we were talking to One Up Health, and it's always a real absolute pleasure to learn from you, to hear your experience. I think you'd be pleased to know that the National Provider Directory, the CMS, has started acquisition on that. That just dropped
Very
last
exciting.
week. Yeah, it's
Really exciting.
super
Really
exciting.
empowering. Kudos to Amy and
Amy,
Dr. Oz and Chris Klump and the team. Yeah, very excited.
100%. So yeah, thank you, and yeah, I hope you will come back and keep dropping knowledge on top of Gene and I.
Well,
Yes.
I don't know. There may be a line between knowledge and opinion, but certainly
All the same.
have the opinions. All right, guys.
Love it.
This was
Take
awesome.
care.
Thank you so much, Don.
Yeah,
Thanks.
appreciate you, Don. Thank you.